The reality is China is an authoritarian system. It is a dictatorship. You have there an immense security state apparatus, to the point that they're watching anybody at Tiananmen Square and seeing what they do. Do they leave flowers? Do they do something like that? Well, you'll get a security card on you very quickly. So these kinds of things, facial recognition to track people across a population, using things like social credit scores to shame and control the population, to such an extent. They have re-education camps, these modern day type of concentration camps for the Uyghur population. This is not the West. This is not a Western country. This isn't just a normal economic viable alternative to trading with the United States. I'm not saying that Canada can't trade with China. Sure, it can trade with China, but it has to do so from understanding the country that China is, not the country that Canada wants it to be.
Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Christopher Coates, Director of Foreign Policy, National Defense, and National Security here at MLI. Prime Minister Mark Carney has recently returned from a high-profile trip on the world stage, including a visit to China, which saw his government announce a new strategic partnership with Beijing. There's been lots of attention and discussion on the Canadian canola and electric vehicle deals to emerge from this, with reductions in tariffs in both cases. But much less has been said by the government about the China that Prime Minister previously called the biggest geopolitical threat to Canada, or about the guardrails Carney has said are necessary to deal with Beijing. The government has not addressed reports that Canadian journalists traveling with the delegation felt it necessary to use burner phones on this trip to Canada's new strategic partner. But those are the exact kinds of security concerns that should give Canadians and their government pause, especially when considered in light of decades of attempted foreign interference in Canada by Beijing, a history that we'll explore in this episode. To give us that context, I'm joined by Dr. Dennis Molinaro, author of the recently published book, Under Assault, an incredible investigation that details Beijing's 5 decades of interference with Canada's political and public life. Dennis is a trained historian and an expert in security, espionage, and counterintelligence. He's worked in government as a national security analyst and policy advisor, and is now on the faculty of Ontario Tech University. Before we begin, please remember to like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people with these conversations. Dennis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, let's get started. On Prime Minister Carney's recent trip to China, he talked about a new world order and a strategic partnership with China. That looks like a big shift from Carney calling China the biggest security threat facing Canada less than a year ago. What stands out to you from the PM's recent time on the world stage, and what does it indicate to you about where he's taking Canada's relationship with China?
I think the move to calling the PRC a strategic partner was a premature one. I think that really the focus has to be on the integrated markets that we've got with the United States right now, and we've got to settle the disputes that we have with this administration. This attempt to shift to China, I find is going to be one that's going to be met with disappointment. The PRC has never been a reliable trading partner for this country. I mean, it has frequently weaponized trade. It's engaged in interference and espionage against Canada over time, over many decades. And so I see them as not really living up to any kind of commitments that they're going to put forward. I mean, they weaponized canola before. If anything, I think that this recent arrangement that they've made in terms of having EVs shipped to Canada in exchange for the lifting of canola is not going to last, because I see an eventual retaliation coming down the road, again, because they know it's a pressure point and they know that Canada is basically dependent on this type of trade and hasn't diversified it. And so I'm afraid that it might reward coercion in the future.
Interesting. You talked about never being a reliable partner and having interfered for many decades. We'll come to that in a moment, sort of that historical aspect. Um, but going back to the recent visit, Prime Minister Carney has talked about putting guardrails on the relationship. Do you see signs of those guardrails in the approach he took on this trip?
No, I haven't seen any, and that's part of the problem. Is that it would have been, I think, more prudent to have some type of guardrails in place, notify the Canadian public what they were, have something put forward from the past in terms of that was agreed to, like a foreign agent registry that was passed in legislation. There's talk now that a commissioner is potentially going to be appointed eminently, but at the same time, that's not still the creation of a registry. The regulations that I saw around that are make it sound more as if it's going to be some type of attempt to manage influence rather than punish it if it's being done by a foreign state. So we haven't had any announcements of what the government would do with PRC EVs as they get here. I mean, there's basic limitations that you could put in terms of where they could drive and where you could park them. For instance, you couldn't park them maybe in some workplaces. We might see restrictions like that, but then why would you buy these cars to begin with? And then secondly, the issue of terms of will the United States allow them to cross the border? There's going to be parts. There's going to be a need to service these vehicles. That's going to start integrating into the North American auto supply chains. The Americans have already indicated they won't tolerate that and are against that. So I see this as not a good deal in general.
Okay, let's come back to Carney's recent moves in a moment, and whether his present direction on the relationship is one that'll serve Canada's interests. But first, we want to put this in some historic context. You're the author of an excellent book that lays out the history of Canada-China relations and how foreign interference has played a part of that. Let's start from the beginning. You describe in the book how Pierre Trudeau may have been an early target of Chinese Communist Party regime. Can you talk about what were their goals in targeting him and how did they go about this?
Sure. So, in the book, one thing I'd say off the start is that the historical record is still, much of it is still redacted. So it's hard to get the complete picture. So I tried to do what I could with the sources that I have. So I have a number of qualifiers just to make sure that I'm not exaggerating things or taking things out of context. But in general, what it appears to me from the documents that I was able to get declassified was that there was an attempt, it looks like there was an attempt to influence the Canadian government around the recognition of China. Now, that makes actually kind of sense, a lot of sense, in terms of the PRC wanting to engage in some type of influence operation because of how valuable they considered international recognition to be and wanting that recognition from the United States. So, in that sense, that seems plausible. And the way that it seems to have worked was through at least one avenue that it was used was by having an individual named Paul Lynn, who was an academic in Canada. The RCMP regarded him as an agent of influence for the CCP and that he was essentially representing China's interests. They were warning government. They considered him dangerous in this regard. And they were on him pretty tight in terms of surveillance for decades. And so one thing they do mention is that he was tasked with spreading the ideas of PRC recognition in support of it. And we know he goes on to the US after to do the same. So it appears that that was one of the main vectors that they were using to try to influence the Canadian government and by extension, Pierre Trudeau. I mean, I think that influence attempt may have actually likely started decades earlier, or a decade earlier when he went to China.
Interesting. Talking about Trudeau's earlier trip to China, in your book, you describe a book that Trudeau co-authored about one of his early visits to China. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the highlights from that book and what it reveals about Trudeau's views on China?
Sure. I mean, it Well, it reveals a few things. One, it reveals that he had this overly simplistic, romanticized view of China, and that the establishment of a new communist government there was doing wonderful things. And that it was, it had these open air prisons, and there was no locks on the door, and there were these communes that were built that were all in one, doing all kinds of wonderful things for the people. And of course, what he doesn't discuss, or he isn't shown, is the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. He isn't shown the famine that's taking place in China. He hasn't shown any of these things, or the subjugation of Tibetans. And so it leaves you. So on one side, that's what his interpretation is, overly romanticized and simplistic of what's going on there. On the other, it reveals that they went to a great deal of trouble to portray China in this way to Trudeau. Now, why would you do that? Just off the face of it, it seems to me like it's because maybe they were potentially investing in this individual. I mean, that's not unheard of, and it wouldn't in the counterintelligence world. It wouldn't be unheard of for foreign states to, put a bunch of eggs in a bunch of different baskets, hoping that something turns out. So it wouldn't surprise me if they were trying to get a nice romanticized view of China for Pierre Trudeau in the hopes that this might pay off down the road. I mean, they even had his books in a little fake library there to flatter him, so to speak. So, why go to all that trouble for just an average academic tourist or lawyer? Right? It doesn't make sense.
Do you think that Trudeau knowingly allowed this to occur? Both the earlier episodes that you talked about when he was visiting and getting the material for his book, but then later when he led sort of the Canadian connection with the PRC. Do you think Trudeau knowingly allowed this to occur?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think there was an overly romanticized view of countries like China, and that they could do things differently, and that there was a progressive movement there that could solve the problems that capitalism could not solve. And so I think he was very eager to maybe try to believe that and see what he wanted to see in that sense. I wouldn't see it as overly malicious in the sense of willfully doing something against Canadian interests, but I think overly romanticized and a willingness to believe that this is possible, that something better has emerged there. And I think there's some new biographies actually of Trudeau that'll be coming out that kind of show that.
You mentioned earlier that one of the objectives of the Chinese may have been to get Canada to recognize the PRC, and perhaps their one China policy. Um, Maybe a bit of speculation now on your part, but what do you think would have been in Canada's best interest when it came to both of those activities for the recognition of the PRC and one China? What should Canada perhaps actually have done at the time?
It's hindsight's 2020, I guess, in a way. But I the part that I have the most difficulty with is that the Taiwan issue, because that's something that was critically important for the PRC. Because in the eventual recognition of China, and it's worth pointing out, Canada wasn't the first one to recognize China. I mean, the French, the English had done it before the UK had done it, but they weren't so, I would say, dialed into the Taiwan issue in the way the PRC wanted it. And so for Canada, when they note the PRC's position on Taiwan, the PRC interpreted it as accepting their position. And so that element of the Taiwan issue, I wish that Canada had not been so explicit over. And even if they felt that the recognition talks were going slightly sideways, then maybe that would have been for the best. Because I think there was an over reliance or a zeal to try to be first out the gate in terms of North America, and really do this so that other countries could copy it, so that the United States could pay attention. And it was really, I felt that from reading the documents, there was this effort for Canada to kind of do some nationalist kind of chest thumping. In other words, let's be internationally recognized for this and beat the United States. And even Trudeau mentions at one time that they beat the Americans to this. And I think that kind of blinded them to accept things that maybe they shouldn't have accepted.
If we move on from the Trudeau, how would you characterize the targeting of Canada and Canadian officials during the Mulroney era? Was there any change in approach or the impacts?
So in this time period, we start to get really China's just starting to open up its economy, and so it's starting to get more investment. It's not quite what happens with the '90s, and that's largely because the Tiananmen Square massacre kind of really shuts things down. So that is the biggest change. But there's still an effort to try to get back there as soon as that, almost literally within a year after that massacre ends, in terms of it taking place. Then there was this big rush to try to get back into China as quickly as possible. But so much of the '80s, what I got from some declassified documents was a lot in terms of the issues China's focused on with Canada concerns the Taiwanese, and so they're trying to counter Taiwan views of Taiwan individuals who fled and came to Canada. And so there's a lot of really back and forth between those two communities, and that's playing out locally. But in terms of going over there, we don't see much in terms of the investments and such that happened later in the '90s.
Okay. Um, I'd be interested in your thoughts on what was behind the rush to get in, but let's save that maybe for another discussion. If we move on from the Mulroney era, then into the Chrétien era, one source you spoke to for the book, Chen Yonglin, who had defected from from the Chinese Communist Party, revealed that a CCP document had listed two old friends of China, one being Pierre Trudeau, the other Jean Chrétien. Can you tell us about what that term means and how China's view of Chrétien as a friend may have shaped interference and Canada-China relations more generally in Chrétien's era as Prime Minister?
Sure. One thing I could say about the '80s too is that they start to develop the aid for trade kind of philosophy, but we can save that for another and policies, so we can say that for another talk. But for the Chrétien years, yeah. So there's a reference that was made. So Chen Yongling mentions old friends. So, and this was in his dive into oceanic affairs file when he was still working for the PRC. So the way he explained it to me was that this was a term that signified an individual had a very positive, long-standing relationship with the government, with the CCP, actually with the party. And they were looked at, it's a very honorable type of title that they would give people. And it's different than friends, is what I was told. So friends can kind of come and go, and they have, they may not last, but old friends is something that spans across governments. It spans across time. And so the reference, he said that Pierre Trudeau and both Chrétien were referred to that, as well as Henry Kissinger. Now, what you've seen in the last few years actually was when Chrétien was in China before the Carney visit, they actually publicly referred to him as an old friend. And they did to Kissinger as well in the last years of his life. So it is something that they kind of, it's almost like an honorary title that they grant someone. It has nothing to do in terms of the Chinese people. It's more like the government and the party specifically.
Okay. At that time, there was a big Team Canada trade mission in the '90s. What was the impact of that trade visit to China?
To be honest, I think the impact is one that we're still feeling today, in the sense that it set up this type of romanticized view that really seemed to stick within Canadian government circles and culture, even parties, political parties, that China was a place of booming business. You could do lots of business there, get rich. It would be great for the country. That was really, I guess, heavily promoted at the time, and it hasn't really gone away, and it still comes up and manifests itself repeatedly in spite of all the security concerns and issues that we've had with China. And that's important, that it seems to prevail over and above any of those concerns. And so the visit really was billed that way, that this was going to be, get into China because it's going to be a great thing for Canada. And it's, they rally together with this Team Canada image and jerseys and what have you. And they go there. The Can-Do reactor deal is announced that Canada was going to be selling 2 of those to the PRC. And from that, what's interesting, though, is when I looked at the numbers that came out from the 1990s, Canada ends up with a trade deficit to the PRC, and also a shift that happens where the PRC starts sending more advanced technological goods to Canada, which was, I think the intention was to have that be the other way around. But instead, Canada ends up buying from the PRC rather than doing a whole lot of selling over there.
You talked to you mentioned the Can-Do reactors just now.
Mm.
For your book, you talked to a former Canadian government official about that deal, and maybe there are some red flags raised at that time. Can you talk about the red flags?
So what they were referring to was, it was essentially a culture, kind of a generalized mindset that there could. So they didn't really elaborate on what those were, but I guess there were just in general a concern of selling this type of technology to the PRC. But they discussed a general culture or mindset that, well, Canada's always going to kind of be one step ahead. So that it was fine to sell technology like that because we'd always be ahead of the game, so to speak. That hasn't really panned out, actually. So it was a mistake then, and I think it would be a mistake now to also be engaging in trade with the PRC with any kind of strategic technology of any kind, or even receiving it, such as EVs. We were talking about that before. But it also leads to all kinds of different types of agreements and sales that take place. I mean, we could talk about some of those. For instance, the Canadian companies end up selling the PRC the engines to their first attack helicopters. They do it once and they try to do it again years later. They approved a sale of spy planes to the PRC. And you had a government official in news reports basically saying that, well, if our export controls block it, then what we could do is send the plane to Israel and then have the spy tech and spy technology installed there, and then they'll ship it from there to the PRC. In other words, you had government officials basically trying to find ways to skirt their own export controls to sell this stuff, which blew me away when I read that news report from I think it was CTV that it first appeared in the archival document. And then we have no idea if the deal ever happened because it got publicized in the news. But it was just really shocking to see the length that Canada was willing to go in terms of the types of things they were willing to sell.
That's incredible. Dan, so let's move on to the Harper era. And you note that era began with a reset on China relations, focusing on human rights, but in later years it gave way to sort of an enticement of business deals.
Mm-hmm.
How would you characterize the relations in the Harper era?
So again, as you mentioned, it starts off where it looks like there's going to be a tougher line with the PRC, where Canada is going to have more of a stern kind of approach to the PRC and guard itself a little bit more. But that caves and it gives way to more of these kinds of deals that it just didn't seem to benefit Canada. I mean, we ended up more tourists. There was a tourist agreement. We ended up with the origins of the strategic partnership date back to around that time. But then we also get things like the Montreal consulate. I think the deal gets created where that gets built here. And then again, Canada reaffirms the one China policy, is asked to do that, and it does publicly. So again, it just seemed as if we were starting to make some progress, where we were starting to put our foot down on some more issues. But then I think part of the issues as well is the economy played into this as well, slight downturns, and then a reversal. We get into things like the 2008 recession, right? And then that again, there's backpedaling in search of goods and money from China that just never really pays off in the long run.
What kind of targeting or interference towards Canadian decision makers was occurring during that period?
So we also get the collapse of Nortel happening in this period. So there's a whole chapter in the book on that, and how essentially the PRC hackers had completely gutted the company of its intellectual property, its IP, and its technology. Just basically a nonstop hacking effort that ripped it to shreds. So that happens in this time period as well. You're also we are getting reports then in that time period too of more hacking, cyber attacks that are being launched against the Canadian government from China. And again, the government is aware of this, but is going into these deals and arrangements with the PRC. And then there's the level of influence that starts to take place that is pretty blatant and overt, but no one seems to have a problem with it. I mean, I had one journalist tell me that it was pretty common that back in those days that the PRC embassy would have these open parties where politicians would just come in to drink and to eat at the PRC embassy, and the PRC loved it. And this was a weekly thing that they would invite. Politicians were welcome to just binge there, and have these parties there with the Chinese embassy. So it just boggles the mind that this was a regular thing that was going on, and it continued on. And the inclination that I got was that they wished it could continue, but they wanted it to be a normalized thing, but it didn't happen that way.
Okay. Let's move on now to the Justin Trudeau era. And in the latter part of that Trudeau's era, there were concerns about foreign interference that I'm sure all of our listeners are aware of, including from China, that became a hot national political issue. What stands out to you from the revelations in that period, this recent, the last 5-6 years, and how does this reflect the history up to this point?
Actually, it tends to reflect the history pretty accurately, because really it was when, after the Hogue inquiry was launched as a result of all these types of revelations that come out, and you see the testimony from government officials and the Prime Minister, where they just discount episodes of interference and influence as being regular diplomatic activity, and they're just unwilling to see a threat anywhere in this. And so then that tends to then reinforce actually the thesis of the book, which is largely centers around the idea that Canada was seeing and believing what it wanted to, irrespective of what it was shown. And so there's a difference there between, receiving information or intelligence and thinking that has some kind of action that has to be taken. But when you have a kind of a cultural mindset like this, where you believe in a version of China that you want to believe in, it doesn't matter what you're shown. It doesn't matter what you have, because you'll default to that. And you see the government doing that right now. You see it absolutely happening right now, where in spite of the Prime Minister Carney just saying a year ago that China was the largest threat, now seemingly being unable to utter the same words just 1 year later, and believing that China will benefit Canada, irrespective and regardless of what's happened in the past. Um, and so in that sense, you could bring anything forward, and I don't think it would matter.
You mentioned just a moment ago about the kinds of activities that were going on being viewed as regular diplomatic activity. Can you help us understand what's the difference between legitimate diplomacy or trade and foreign interference?
So the differences really rely on the covert aspect. And it's easy for viewers and listeners to understand. If there's something you can't do in the light of day that doesn't look well or good, and it has to default to covert behind the scenes, right away you're into something that's probably a problem. And that's really the differences for foreign influence. Diplomats will regularly do reach out and try to understand the country that they're working in, and they'll try to make relationships and friendships and what have you. They'll do that kind of outreach all the time, and that's normal. It's when the activity becomes covert behind the scenes that people are trying to hide and deny. Then we're into the area of a foreign government trying to influence potentially somebody based on what those conversations are. So it's not even just the fact that they're covert; it's also the fact of what is the substance of those conversations, or what kind of deals are taking place, and are they covert ones? And so that's when we start getting into the realm of malign foreign influence or interference. And so that's really the buffer here is that kind of activity.
In your book, you make a very deliberate effort to indicate that everything you're relating is public information. So, without revealing any secrets, could you give us some examples, maybe of this foreign interference taking place, these covert activities that you're talking about?
Sure. I mean, like there's a number that were discussed in the Hogue inquiry, but there's also things that are actually one of the best ones is that takes place is in the world of academia, actually. Because there's an effort there where you have the PRC openly trying to form these relationships with scholars and researchers. But at the same time, what's not public and what's not really widely known is that when they have to sign these agreements, that the IP is going to be turned over to the PRC as a result of that research. So they'll get research dollars and funding and money, but at the same time, China will acquire the rights to the intellectual property and the research. And so that's a level of influence, trying to influence prominent people in a society to try to get that benefit for the PRC. But influence and interference, we talked about the political realm, but could also happen within the communities as well, where they're trying to influence what is said about China or the debates and discussions that are happening about China, try to steer the country to view it a certain way. That can heavily be targeted against Chinese, Canadian, and other diaspora communities within Canada. That's something that they live with daily. But it could also happen on a broader scale where the PRC is trying to covertly influence the ideas of Canadians. And I think we're probably seeing this right now when it comes to our disputes with the Americans. For the PRC, it's advantageous to get a wedge between us and the United States, and to amplify that wedge. And so I would not be surprised at all if they're doing that right now.
You'd mentioned that we may be getting closer to the appointment of foreign interference commissioner. 18 months, almost approaching 2 years after the legislation was passed. But why is Canada a comparatively permissive environment? Why do we lag our allies on deterrence and enforcement and transparency?
I think again it comes back to that issue, the central issue of the book, where it's a belief that somehow China could be an alternative and that to the United States or a counterweight, and it can't. It's not going. It's not realistic in any way to think that Canada can latch itself onto the PRC in any capacity and that it's going to ultimately benefit us. And so, but I think there's a continual view then that security gets in the way of that, having that kind of a relationship with China. It gets in the way of trade. And the result is that it shouldn't, because for the PRC, they link trade with security all the time. Um, the economy and companies and corporations, everyone in the PRC is dialed in to security. Why? Because in the PRC, it's a national law that they can force a company to help the intelligence apparatus of the state. So they've baked in security all the time to trade and to business arrangements and everything else. And so Canada's being naive if it thinks that the PRC interest is anything but, in the interest of the PRC and anything that it does, right? And so that's I would say the main reason why we don't see that kind of more rigorous guardrails or security aspect that gets put together with our dealings with China.
Let's just build on that for a second, Dennis. What are some, I'll say, other realities about China that Canadians and their leaders should stop ignoring or better understand and pay attention to?
I would say just one, it's something that people seem to forget when they compare dealing with China to dealing with a country like the United States. You can have any kind of, I would say, you can have your own political ideologies or views about the United States. You can view it any way you want. But the reality is, China is an authoritarian system. It is a dictatorship. You have there an immense security state apparatus, to the point that they're watching anybody at Tiananmen Square and seeing what they do. Do they leave flowers? Do they do something like that? Well, you'll get a security card on you very quickly. So these kinds of things, facial recognition to track people across a population, using things like social credit scores to shame and control the population. To such an extent, they have re-education camps, these modern day type of concentration camps for the Uyghur population. These are things that the West, this is not the West. This is not a Western country. This isn't just a normal economic viable alternative to trading with the United States. And it's never going to be. And I think that's what we really have to understand.
One of the things that fascinated me in your book was that you identify that, and these are my words, so I hope I get it right, that China considers their sovereignty extends outside their national borders, almost globally. If I've got that right, what does that mean in a Canadian context?
Sure. So what I was trying to do was try to understand how the PRC understands and perceives the threat that it believes a threat from diaspora communities. We often hear about transnational repression. So what I was trying to get at theoretically was, okay, well, why is China engaging in transnational repression? And it's a little different than past examples, because it's been going, that type of activity has been going on for a long time from authoritarian states. The Soviet Union kind of developed that, really, if you want to go back there, trying to go after Ukrainian nationalists and assassinate them in the Cold War, or lure people back to the Soviet Union to try to entrap them and what have you. So they've always been after dissidents because it's a population in exile that can challenge the authority of the state. With the PRC, what I noticed that makes them a little bit more different is they try to heavily invest in steering people to be aligned with the PRC as if they were still in the PRC, as if they were still a citizen there. And so for me, that demonstrated that they have this type of transnational kind of conception of sovereignty, that they believe they are sovereign over you wherever you are, if you're from the PRC, and that any other country's laws or restrictions doesn't concern them. What concerns them is how you behave wherever you are, and so they try to project that authority, irrespective of where the person is.
Wow, that's just so revealing, I think, in terms of what we're facing as we consider creating a strategic partnership with China. Um, Dennis, with that background established, let's come back to the present now.
Sure.
And how do you see Prime Minister Carney's latest moves sort of in that historical context? Is he leading Canada further down the same or a similar erroneous path of past governments?
Yeah, at the moment, yes, I do. I see it as um, not acknowledging the type of country the PRC is, and the integratedness we have in our economy with the United States. I mean, something that comes up often that I see is people making a claim of why can't we trade with China, especially if the United States trades. The United States trades more with China than Canada does. No one is saying, and I'm not saying, that Canada can't trade with China. Sure, it can trade with China, but it has to do so from understanding the country that China is, not the country that Canada wants it to be. So if Prime Minister Carney's words about seeing the world and dealing with the world as it is, if that really does apply, then it means recognizing the country that China is and understanding that this is not just a simple replacement for the United States. It's never going to be. And that we are a trading country, but we are not the world's largest economy. The United States is, and it's right next door. And it has an integrated supply chain with us in a lot of industries and an integrated market in a lot of industries, and primarily automotive. So that means that sure, we can trade with them, but they have way more in terms of the ability to absorb shocks, absorb retaliations, counter retaliate against a country. They have the ability, they have more security protections. They do trade on some level sometimes with China on things that I don't agree with, but they are a large enough economy that they can manage things. Whereas Canada, when it gets hit with retaliation, look at what happens. It's essentially buckled because it doesn't have the ability to absorb those shocks as easily as the United States does. So it has to understand, if you're going to trade with China, understand what you're getting into and also understand your responsibilities in an integrated market in terms of not introducing products or technologies that could endanger that market.
Dennis, getting close to the end of our time. So what risks do you see when governments move quickly on new deals or partnership language, or when Canada moves quickly without matching security measures?
We end up paying for it later. We end up going through this pattern that tends to repeat itself where we engage in these types of deals. Something the PRC reveals itself to be as it is, not as we want it to be. Canada is shocked, ends up with a diplomatic spat, and then in very short few years after that, the nostalgic blinders are on again, and we're back to doing the same thing. And we're going to keep repeating that pattern unless we actually recognize what type of country we're dealing with. And again, we can trade, but we have to be much more careful in how we approach this. And promising the kinds of things or that Prime Minister Carney was promising, like law enforcement cooperation, without explaining what that means or how would that affect the communities in Canada that are dealing with transnational repression. China uses its corruption mechanism, its idea of chasing economic fugitives in fox hunt, as a means of targeting people that it views are against the PRC. So, are we going to be assisting in that? Like, what does law enforcement cooperation mean, and why even get into that if that has nothing to do with trade? So again, it's those types of things bother me when we go down these roads that we don't need to be going down.
Dennis, thanks so much for sharing all of your experience and insights, sharing some of the revelations in your book with us. Are any last thoughts before we wrap up for the day?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that you know we're in a time where we have to, I think, I understand the urge to try to do something quickly, to diversify our trade. I get that. But diversification of trade, especially the size with the United States, is a decades-long process. It's not something you can do overnight, and it's not something you're ever totally going to be able to do. So I would say the first priority is to find a way to manage our relationship with the U.S. and not get blinded by, China and thinking, because all that glitters there is not gold.
All right. Thanks so much, Dennis.
Thank you.
Thanks. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to this MLI podcast. For MLI, I'm Christopher Coates. Thank you for joining us on Inside Policy Talks.